So welcome to the latest podcast episode of Growth Ripples. Today I'm joined by Dave Munro. It's been a pleasure to have him really on this particular podcast. So Dave, maybe just a quick spiel for those of our listeners that don't actually know who you are.
Yeah, fantastic. So my name's Dave, as you mentioned. I'm the CEO of a brand called Executive Performance Partners, which works with leading CEOs and organisations to deliver higher performance through their leadership activity.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. And I should point out to our listeners one key point. Dave and I know each other from many moons ago. And I actually, for full disclosure, I helped get Dave into a role at a shared ex-employer. But no surprise to anyone who knows Dave, he was just purely too entrepreneurial to stick around for too long in that role. And he went on to much bigger and greater things. But it's been a pleasure being able to stay connected with you. A little bit less over the last few years, but we've obviously just reconnected recently.
Jan, you're too modest with that role. For your listeners, Jan put me through the ringer before joining a global consulting organisation together, and definitely left a positive impression. So I've been glad to reconnect in recent years.
Oh, thanks, Dave. Very kind, very kind. So what we wanted to share with people today, and we talked about this very briefly before, and like I've shared with our listeners before, it's completely unscripted. We just try to pick some topics. But Dave was particularly keen to talk about the topics of accountability and performance, because it's a key area of passion for him and for me as well. So Dave, what was it about these two topics that really that you gravitated towards for today?
Yeah, fantastic. Look, through my career, results orientation's always been a key focus for me. And it's been something that I've struggled to really bring to life in some of the big consulting houses that I worked in. So following the sale of my last business, I was reflecting on what to do next and realised that the world of leadership and executive coaching was a really well-intended space, but really lacking that link through to accountability and performance. And so it's been something that we've been passionately delivering now for 3 years. And I think for your listeners, it's really about how do we turn these well-intended concepts into bottom line results.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very topical issue as well, given, potential recession talk, both globally and locally, and performance and accountability is obviously a key part of that. For you and your journey, Dave, what do you see as the biggest kind of either principles or practical things that your clients take away from, working with you in particular?
Yeah, look, rather than, focusing specifically on any particular story, starting at a high level, I think that the main aha that we have early with clients is really getting them to understand what success looks like through techniques like appreciative inquiry, where we're able to use what we know about neuropsychology now, and we know our brains are much better at looking backwards than they are at looking forwards now. And interestingly enough, working with global businesses and fast growth, medium-sized businesses, more often than not, they're continuing to do what they've always done rather than being able to get ahead of that performance curve and look back and to do some really good planning. So for me, accountability and performance starts very clearly with what we call a scorecard for success, which is how are we going to measure true success between now and, say, 3 months from now in measurable ways that are outside of just BAU, outside of what we've always done. And that's the interesting thing about accountability at that CEO level is we tend to get away with just doing the BAU stuff. And then 5 o'clock rocks around and we haven't got to those optional extras, those things that take us from good to great. And that's where I'm finding a lot of clients having a lot of success is being able to articulate those 1%ers that will transform the business and giving some accountability around getting to those activities because the BAU takes over.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people that can relate, and I can relate having been in lots of senior roles, never quite CEO roles, but senior roles where, you're just so busy in the day to day that those things that are maybe less urgent, but really critical for future success and future performance kind of get left by the wayside. What do you find is, how do you help circuit break that? Because you talked before, I'm really interested to dig a bit deeper on that element about we're much better, you said, around looking back than looking forward. So how do you help people close that gap?
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm a bit older than you, Jan. So when I came through university, There were topics like gap analysis, and for your listeners, I'm sure we've heard those things. Interestingly enough, when I came through uni and I studied psychology as well, we didn't know a lot about the brain. And we've learned a hell of a lot more about the brain in the last 5 years than we knew in the previous 200 years. And the interesting thing about our brain is it's actually been designed to be a memory bank, not a foresight bank. And so there are now techniques that we can use the structures of our brains to have clearer thinking. I mentioned a technique before called appreciative inquiry, which effectively takes our listeners to a moment where success has already happened. We're effectively hacking our brain and then asking them to reflect back on their current state as if it was yesterday, using memory in our brains. And then we have these moments of aha and those moments of insight, doing what I call accessing wisdom early, where that future you, which to your brain feels like today, can give the current you, which to your brain feels like it was yesterday, advice on how it got here, not how it would get here. And it's amazing the crystallization around what is important right now when we look through that lens.
Yeah, I mean, I love those kind of brain hacks. And, what resonates for me there, Dave, is, the way that you talked about putting someone in the mindset of the future and then giving advice to your past self. You often hear people say, well, if I was to give myself, advice, when I was 18 and now I'm, 30, whatever, this is what I would do. And you're basically doing that in the future. I mean, that's quite amazing. I mean, is there any particular stories that you could share with people around how you've brought that to life for people?
Yeah, absolutely. And they say that hindsight is 20/20, and I say to my clients, well, you can actually access your hindsight early. One great example of that is a leading business here in Australia in the food manufacturing space, and they've been in business for a number of years before we started working with them. I started to work not only with the CEO but with the whole executive team around an appreciative inquiry and understanding what's going to transform their business from a good business to a great business. Interestingly enough, as we started to go through that technique and then started to embed some performance-based coaching associated with those goals, the business that had taken a number of years to reach a certain valuation was able to double in valuation within 6 months. 6 months later, we were able to list that business on the ASX. And only 8 months later, they were approached by a global business in their space to take them out as a trade sale. In effect, we doubled and then doubled and then doubled again, all within 18 months. And if you actually ask that CEO, and they're on our website and talk around that experience themselves, what was the difference before that acceleration curve? He will talk about using those techniques to understand success as if it had already happened and to build the plan as if we had already done it, as opposed to that foresight part of our brain, which is a very new part of our evolutionary brain, to imagine a future that hasn't happened yet. What they've been doing for the first 9 years. In the last 3 years, we've seen that business explode because the executive are all working towards an outcome that their brains have already imagined happening, as opposed to asking them to set strategy into a world which they've never imagined or experienced before.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's, very much music to my ears. And what really came up for me as you were talking about that was some of the sporting analogies. Like, I don't know about you, Dave, but I mean, I used to play quite a bit of basketball when I was younger. And I remember the coach would always talk to me about, visualize that the ball's already gone in. And then what is it that your hands and your arms had to do in order for that to take place? And you're kind of doing that, but applying it in a business sense, which is quite powerful. And the other piece that I really like is that, the brain is often and I studied some psychology similar to you, is that the brain is a fear sort of making machine and it's keeping us safe. So you're actually circumnavigating around that and going, well, actually, if the success has already taken place, you need to worry less about it failing and more about how do you get the success that has already happened.
And that you've nailed it, Jan, without going into too much detail. By doing appreciative inquiry, we put that threat response in our brain to bed because it's feeling like success has already happened. We're engaging that limbic system because we engage them with the senses. When I get them to imagine success has happened, I actually imagine them sitting, having a Christmas drink with me. feeling the condensation on that glass, hearing the chatter, feeling the seed underneath them. The brain, once it gets those senses involved, imagines that moment as if it is happening right now. And all of a sudden, we're able to access that really smart new part of our brain that said, well, if I'm here now and I look back on the conversation we're having today as if it was yesterday, how would I have made the first steps to bridge that gap? And instead of doing gap analysis or things in IT like waterfall or agile, we're actually understanding how our brains work for the first time. And we're accessing deeper, stronger parts of our brain than what I've traditionally seen in boardrooms around the world, where we're trying to imagine a future that hasn't happened yet. And that's very difficult for our brains to actually do well. We can do it, but we can do it much better as if it had already happened and accessing effectively memory banks as opposed to foresight banks.
Yeah. I mean, I love it. And I'm even just reflecting as well about some of the studies with brain scans around when someone imagines something to have happened, particularly if they can do it very vividly, the same parts of the brain light up as when that incident actually happens. So you are sort of affecting change on so many different levels, both in the brain, in the psyche, in the mindset, in the consciousness. The other piece, I guess I'm keen, maybe on the flip side, Dave, to understand is I'm sure not everyone you speak to is open to this way of thinking or this way of applying, the brain or just, again, thinking about it. How have you sort of overcome that? Or, what do you find some of the biggest blockers in this kind of space?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm smiling because I remember one of our foundation clients in this business, and that level of skepticism was well earned by that CEO. He'd seen, in his words, enough shiny shoe consultants in his life. And so there was a natural level of skepticism there around doing this psych mumbo jumbo, if you like.
Yeah.
We started working with that leader around really understanding what right now was causing him pain. What were the things that were causing that threat response? Because, of course, while it's natural skepticism, it triggers that part of our brain that's fight, flight, or freeze. And so by working through small, real moments right now, we're actually able to train the brain that this was a safe space. And over time, we're able to extend the horizons of that CEO's thinking. I'm pleased to say that organisation, which was a small professional services firm based in WA, actually, is now a thriving national business that is growing exponentially. And essentially, all that we've allowed them to do is to overcome that we've always done it this way mindset, because that's what the threat part of the brain was making us do, into some blue sky thinking. But most organisations stop at that point. We then translated that into an accountability framework. So those it's actually happened, as opposed to dying in the workshop, which I'm sure we've all seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that leads me to kind of the next piece I'm keen to kind of unpack a little bit. You talk about getting people into the mindset as though things have already happened and working with the exec team. When it comes to the accountability, particularly when often the doers aren't the ones in the executive team, like, how do you help translate, an executive team that has come up with a great future-focused solution that, they've been in that mindset, but then having to work and influence people that have not gone through that journey? How do you approach, or how do you find that executives can overcome that hurdle?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And we focus exclusively on working with senior leaders and executives. So as those messages cascade down to the business, it really comes down to empowering those senior leaders with the right leadership habits, if you like, that allows those messages to cascade down. Probably the one that comes most to mind is a framework come up by Marshall Goldsmith called Leadership as a Contact Sport. It's a really interesting framework, and I won't bore your listeners with the detail, but in short, he realised that leadership is a frequency game. And so it was all about the frequency at which that message went out to the organisation. And a lot of leaders I work with will say to me, but I've told them, Dave, I've said that to them. And my simple correction of that mindset is, if we were releasing a new product to the market, would one ad work? And every leader goes, absolutely not. So why do you think we're changing the DNA of your employees just because we pay them? The reality is humans need messages multiple times to reinforce it. And so when we're working with the senior leaders, we work on a high frequency model. We see our participants every single week, no exceptions. And so we're holding them to account on not just coming up with a great idea, but relentlessly executing it until it becomes a habit within their business. Essentially what we do in our business is we teach leaders how to form better habits than what they had previously, and then to cascade that down into the organization. Because of course habits then become self-sustaining. And we move to the next thing.
Yeah. I mean, very much resonates as well for me about the whole piece. And I was laughing as you were saying the whole piece about, I've told my team or I've told my organization once, so now they should just get on with it. But yeah, that analogy is perfect around, you don't advertise a product once on Channel 7 and expect suddenly everyone in Australia are going to buy it. You've got to do a little bit more messaging than that. So yeah, it very much sings true to me.
And so we've got that empathy for our customers. And my biggest challenge to leaders that I work with is, if we had as much empathy for our talent as we did for our customers, we'd be growing businesses that would be truly exceptional. And so when you ask a marketeer how many times a potential customer needs to hear a message, depending on the research, they'll tell you somewhere between 7 to 15 times. For your listeners, if you're struggling to get a message through to your organisation, I want you to reflect on, have I told them at least 7 to 15 times? Because if not, they probably haven't quite got it yet. Because, of course, their attention has other competing factors. And so repetition is key here, but not repetition in a boring way. We really have to innovate about how we send that message. But I'm yet to see, and Jan, I value your view on this, I'm yet to see an organisation that I walk into where the staff go, you know what? The executive communicate too much with us.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened yet. I don't think it will happen in my lifetime. But constantly we go into organisations and the message is clear, 1 or 2 levels down, and then drops away quickly. This is where that leadership as a contact sport model can really play some dividends for you.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, in my experience, and I often tell clients this about, there's no such thing as over communicating, particularly when it comes to change or behavioral change, because habits, like you said before, they're formed over typically many, many years, maybe a lifetime. So to undo that, you can't just go, oh, look, I'm paying you X amount per year. Here's the new message. Now deliver tomorrow. That just doesn't work in reality. Maybe if we're employing robots, but if we're actually employing humans, which most of us are, then we need to do a lot more than just a one-off message.
I think, put simply, one of my clients defined it this way: paying a salary doesn't change an employee's DNA. And so they're humans at the end of the day, and they're probably not trying to not listen to you as a leader, but they've got so many competing influences going on that unless we're consistent and accountable with our communication around that theme, eventually they'll either get distracted by something else, or, and I hear this a lot in organizations, oh yeah, that's just Dave's idea. That'll come off the radar next month. And so if you're hearing that in your organizations, my advice is to pick and stick. What are the 2 or 3 messages that we need to be relentless with your organization until they become habits, and then we create bandwidth to do more messaging. But most organizations try and push 10 or 15 messages at the same time and wonder why none of them break through.
Yeah. Oh, so true. So true. Well, Dave, I mean, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. I think we're running out of time, but I'd love to have you on the podcast again in the future, and want to wish you and the team all the best. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Jan. Really appreciate it. And same to you and your team. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thanks, Dave.
Cheers.